Yeah, so this week leaders across the Pacific have been celebrating after the International Court of Justice handed down its long-awaited advisory opinion on climate change last week, which is being called one of the most consequential rulings of our times, no less. The opinion basically said that nation states have binding obligations to act on climate change under international law, and that failing to do so could constitute, they said, a, quote, wrongful act. And that was generally hailed across the Pacific this week, not least among the nations that helped drive the issue all the way to the ICJ. One of the groups celebrating was the Pacific Islands Forum, whose Secretary General Baron Waka a few days ago called the opinion a major win for small island nations and predicted that it will galvanize climate-driven action across the region.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't going to download the full opinion of the ICJ, can you give us the ChatGPT summary, please? What did they actually say?
Yeah, so they basically declared that states have legal obligations to prevent climate harm and could face reparations if they don't. It was also a unanimous ruling, which was interesting in itself, though many of the judges have sort of gone on to own their, to add their own little tweaks and notes and tags and so on. But what the court said was that states, can be held responsible under international law for failing to act on climate change, particularly through fossil fuel production, consumption, and subsidies and licensing and so on. So, countries like Australia that say, well, we're just digging stuff up and then sending it overseas, and we have no responsibility for the emissions that happen after the coal goes overseas, can no longer claim that. And simultaneously, island nations like Vanuatu or Samoa or, other small Pacific nations that are directly threatened by the impacts of climate change potentially have the opportunity to lead some sort of litigation of their own, though, that is a whole other big can of worms that's yet to be opened.
And how did this ruling come about? It was because of activists from some of those small nations, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was amazing. This group of very determined Pacific University law students played this incredibly pivotal role in bringing the case in the first place. They basically thought, well, look, the COP summits aren't getting us that far, so why don't we try to push along the potential for seeking an advisory opinion from the ICJ? And they convinced Vanuatu, as it happens, to lead the charge, and then it did make it all the way. That, it's been years in the making. They kicked it off in 2019, and it's only just emerged last week. So, it's been a long process. But yeah, it was led by this really small grassroots activist collective.
Felicity, I know you have an interest in climate stories, and your readers definitely do in the Week Junior as well, and you've been following this sort of thing for years. Do you think this is a significant moment?
I hope so. It's certainly being hailed by a lot of climate change lawyers and climate change activists as such. It depends really on how much weight you put on the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So, for example, the US doesn't recognise the jurisprudence of this court, and this ruling will not be binding on the UK or any of the biggest fossil fuel emitters. Having said that, the judgments handed down by the ICJ do have a lot of weight behind them. They are treated with a lot of gravitas, and it certainly won't be something that can be easily swept under the carpet. But whether it will actually force the big fossil fuel emitters to do anything, particularly we have Trump in the White House, who is, rapidly unraveling everything that the Biden administration had put in place, that it's all drill, baby, drill. So it remains to be seen, really. But I did find it very moving, actually. The case had testimony from 100 countries on the front line of climate change. And there was a quote that really stayed with me, which was, Tuvalu will not go quietly into the rising seas. That's what its delegation told the court. So you got a glimpse into, the first nations and countries and territories who are dealing with climate change right on the front line. And I thought that was very, very powerful. Whether it translates into action, it remains to be seen. And it really comes down to whether you think these big international organizations like the UN or the ICC or the ICJ or COP can do anything, when you have a lot of countries who don't really seem to care about climate change.
Well, it doesn't actually matter that this ruling isn't legally binding, and it doesn't actually matter whether or not you recognise the jurisprudence of the ICJ. What matters is that all of the current climate cases that are being heard around the world will be paying attention to this, and this will have an impact. This is a part of a broader picture of climate litigation. So litigation being a tool in the broader fight against the climate crisis. And we spoke about this on the podcast in March. We spoke about this in the context of a Peruvian farmer who took the German energy company GWE to court over climate emissions, although it had never operated in Peru. So the German courts rejected the case, but they set a really important precedent, which is that they established the legal principle of corporate climate liability. And this was very recently, and no other court had ever done it. So it doesn't necessarily matter about this non-legally binding ruling. What is true is that there are so many climate-related lawsuits ongoing around the world, brought by states and cities and countries, trying to hold companies to account for allegedly harming the climate with their greenhouse gas emissions. So for those companies, the litigation risk is growing and investors will take note.
Yeah, I mean, the point is, Arion, that what they've looked at is not just what's going to come into effect in the future, but also retrospectively. Like, have countries been breaking the law in the past? They've looked at what the laws are. It's clarifying what existing laws are out there.
Yeah, exactly. And that is what the ICJ does. You know, the International Court of Justice, just in a nutshell, it's the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It was established in 1945 and based in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and its main role is to settle legal disputes between states and to provide advisory opinions on legal questions that have been referred by UN bodies and specialized agencies. And that's what they have done here. I actually spoke to a friend of mine, Brendan Plant, who's an international lawyer and academic who served as counsel for Samoa during the ICJ proceedings, and he assisted in drafting Samoa's written pleadings as well as appearing and speaking during the oral hearings in December 2023. And he'd been really, really impressed that the court went so far with this opinion and felt that it had been, in his words, more courageous and muscular than many of the advisory opinions that the ICJ tends to have. But he emphasized really that this is the start of a wave of new litigation. I suppose that's exactly what Harriet's saying. You know, he said that the opinion, quote, clarifies standards. It's the starting gun on new waves of litigation, but it's pretty significant because of the clarity and, of course, because it was a unanimous opinion. So I think that's why this is being hailed as something that's so successful. It won't necessarily mean that Tuvalu gets billions of dollars out of the United States or Exxon or China or whatever, but it may actually help with some of these, like national and local and low-level law cases that are going on as we speak.
Yeah, that's interesting, that conflation that Arion just did there between, for example, China and Exxon. You know, you have states and you have private companies. Does this ruling mean that states are responsible for private companies who have been, mining for fossil fuels, etc.? Because I'm not sure that's always entirely fair. Obviously, some of them are state-owned, but some of them aren't.
So that's a really crucial point to make, actually, about this ruling, that it ruled that the liability was not just on the country for its own emissions, but also on the companies that are based there under their legal jurisdiction. So that's a really crucial point to make.
Felicity, would that be fair, if so?
I think a big sort of tripping up point in this is like the workability, and I think that's where a lot of the criticism has come from. So the idea of fairness feels quite nebulous, really, to get into. I mean, certainly it seems right that powerful countries who, have companies within their territory who are, responsible for this, that there is a shift towards helping the more vulnerable, low-lying countries. That is fair. But in terms of exactly how it's worked out, it does seem very difficult to work out where exactly responsibility lies and how much money. And I mean, there was something that kind of I found confusing about this, is that it seemed to generate a lot of articles where it was talking about reparations, and Jonathan Reynolds in this country, the business secretary, came out saying we shouldn't have to apologize for the Industrial Revolution, which kind of confused me because I didn't necessarily get from the ruling that this was about historic emissions. And I find the idea of reparations tricky, and I find that certainly unworkable. I find it very hard to suddenly start to have to calculate how much the UK would owe to whom for the Industrial Revolution, which also did a lot of really, really good things for the planet. So that that kind of confused me. And just to go back to the workability point, I mean, a very big case in the US that has been 10 years going through the courts, and which the Week Junior was very interested in because it was brought by a group of 21 young people. That was Juliana versus the US. And that has now finally been dismissed this year after 10 years of going through the courts. Although in similar fashion to what we're hearing about this case, a lot of people are saying, well, actually, it has since been replicated in numerous lawsuits. It set up legal action across the country, and it was just remarkably brave to have these 21 young people go up against their government by saying, you're stealing our future from us. And it did have some successes. But on the other hand, the Justice Department, who I think had seen this case through like 3 different administrations or something, they also said it wasn't really something that the judges could rule on because it didn't have a workable remedy to the problem, and it was something that the government had to ultimately weigh in on.
But Arion, what's the point of paying reparations to a nation that might vanish into the sea anyway? I mean, crudely, they won't exist. So does it matter whether you pay the money? What are they going to do with the money? They can't rebuild it.
Well, actually, according to my friend Brendan, he said actually one of the really striking things about this ruling is that even if a country was to go completely underwater, it's still going to maintain, for example, its maritime rights. So there's going to be ongoing state-based entitlements that these countries actually have. And just picking up on that question about reparations, it's easy to see ourselves as the kind of the end point of this story, and that there might be reparations to pay for what's already happened. But I think the term reparations in this context is kind of talking about the decisions that are yet to be made from this moment that are going to potentially continue to exacerbate the problem. And so that could be a country seeking monetary compensation or restoration of affected ecosystems, or, just international pressure for the emitter in question to reduce its carbon emissions. And I think that is the big story here, that this moment is a kind of line in the sand, and the court is saying, all of you countries around the world who think that you don't have responsibilities, you do. And this is us saying that, there are going to be bills coming your way potentially. And that's not necessarily in the context of the ICJ itself, as we've discussed, but it could be at different levels, including nationally.
In terms of Donald Trump, Harriet, he'll just ignore it anyway, won't he?
Unlike most things, this isn't necessarily to do with Donald Trump. I think when we're talking about the fairness or we're talking about the workability, what we're ignoring actually is the social impact. So this is part of what some people call a broader nudge effect. So when you've got legal advisory opinions coming down in this way, and you've got court cases, and you've got science aligning with those, then social license really starts to kind of evaporate. And these companies, these high emitting companies, big oil and gas companies, start to become more socially unacceptable. And that actually does translate into money, because investors are going to take notice of this. Corporate directors will now have to assume that they have this litigation risk. Jeremy Leggett, who's an academic, and he founded a solar energy firm, and he was the first chairman of the Carbon Tracker Initiative think tank. I think that he put it really nicely. So he said, by confirming that states and firms may owe reparations, the ICJ ruling converts moral hazard into material balance sheet hazard. Because when you've got science saying carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions are bad, and then you've got legal bodies like the ICJ saying they're bad, that does mean that the companies who are being held responsible for those emissions become less socially acceptable.
I think it's worth pointing out that the advisory opinion came a day after the chief of the UN said that the fossil fuel industry was actually running out of road because it's being undercut, I think, for the first time by cheaper renewable energy projects. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, really, when you think about China, there's already a massive shift under the way to greener energy, which I think is happening with or without this ICJ ruling, really, because it's more driven by national security concerns, because China doesn't have a lot of its own natural resources. They're very vulnerable to what's going on in the Middle East. And so they're massively ramping up their solar and their wind energy, and also exporting solar panels and turbines. And an incredible stat that 100 solar panels are put up every second in China. The race is on to define the future of energy. The shift is already underway. And even though I know what everyone's going to say, that China is still the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, and we all just want more energy anyway across the globe. But there does seem to be happening a shift to greener energy anyway.